Welcome to Global View. Joining us today is Rabbi YAAKOV Menken, who serves as the Executive Vice President of the Coalition for Jewish Value, the largest rabbinic public policy organization in the United States, representing over 2,500 traditional Orthodox rabbis. In May 2025, he was appointed by President Trump to the Advisory Board of Religious Leaders for the United States Religious Liberty Commission, making him one and only one of the four Orthodox Jewish leaders on the panel. He regularly appears on leading national and international TV and radio networks, and his op-eds have been featured in every major conservative publication in America. Thank you so much for joining the show, Rabbi Menken.
And thank you for having me.
Rabbi, in May 2025, as I mentioned, you have been appointed by President Trump to the Advisory Board of Religious Leaders to the U.S. Religious Liberty Commission. How did that appointment came about, and what does that role entail?
Well, how it came about is really because of a connection to the campaign, watching, Trump. We did not, because we're a 501c3 Coalition for Jewish Values, does not endorse political candidates, but we certainly saw any number of policies that we were anxious to support. And I think that's been borne out when you see what the administration is already doing, that it was clear that, we saw that those policies were going to move things in the right direction, as indeed they have, as far as the priorities of religious liberty, the Jewish community, our safety, etc. So due to that relationship, I think is really where it comes from. And then the people who are on his faith leadership team, and they invited me on. I mean, obviously, if you ask some of his critics, they would certainly use the idea that I was appointed as a religious leader as further evidence that Trump is indeed crazy, and I don't really regard myself as a religious leader as much as a spokesperson. But nonetheless, it's a real honor to be on that commission and be able to work with them. Now, as far as your question as to what our job is actually going to be, I mean, we are it's an advisory board of religious leaders. So, and it's really interesting when you look at the composition of it, that it is 4 Orthodox rabbis. So the only Jewish representatives are Orthodox, and certainly 4 out of 11 is an overbalanced indication of a Jewish presence. There are 4 Catholics, 3 Catholic priests, and 1 other. And then there are 2 Protestants and 1 Greek Orthodox priest. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at that and you say, that's not the composition of America's population, even its religious leadership population, but it's definitely representative of those who have faced religious persecution, even in America, by unfriendly governments and unfriendly individuals. The Blaine Amendments were designed to stifle Catholic education. So you want that Catholic presence. And obviously the Jews are getting attacked, and I've personally had Free Palestine yelled at me over the last few months. This is all, it's the Orthodox Jews who look the part. So it was really obvious that the administration is going out of its way to find the people who are going to be who have the most interest in protecting religious liberty for all. And, I think it's a really good opportunity for us. Do we know exactly what we're going to do? Not yet, because we have to receive our marching orders, but we'll see what the Religious Liberty Commission itself starts to do.
Thank you.
Rabbi, President Trump continues to uphold many campaign promises, and combating anti-Semitism and violence against religious minorities in the United States was certainly one of those major campaign promises. Do you think he's upheld his end of the bargain by combating anti-Semitism, making Jewish Americans feel more safe compared to how they felt under the Biden administration? And what more can be done to stop the scourge of anti-Semitism in the United States and around the world?
Well, what more to be done is a larger topic, obviously. But has he kept his campaign promise? I would say absolutely. I mean, it is clear that there has been a real change between the previous administration and this one with regards to what they're willing to do. The very fact that the administration is being condemned as too aggressive in combating anti-Semitism, too aggressive in telling the universities that they're getting it wrong, indicates how deep-seated the problem really is, and as well as how dedicated the administration is to combating it. We're talking about an America in which a governor's mansion was recently firebombed, in which Molotov cocktails were thrown at Jews, simply trying to call attention to the fact that there are still hostages being held in Gaza. And a pair of Jews, and don't even call them Israeli embassy employees, which they were, but they were not shot for being part of the embassy. They were shot because they were coming out of a Jewish museum. And that's why they were killed in Washington, D.C. And you're going to tell me that efforts to stop that and prevent that from happening again are too aggressive? You have a 5-alarm fire burning, and people are complaining that the administration is bringing too much water.
Well, there is a fact. We have seen a rise in increasing of numbers of incidents against the Jewish community, right? But we've never seen anything alike happening on the other side. We don't see targeting of the other community here in the United States and abroad. It looks like it's a one-sided effort to target one community. Why do you think this phenomenon, despite the measures to prevent it, have been, as you said, even stated as stronger by the current administration, is still happening and is still escalating? Not only happening, but escalating. What's your opinion about that?
Well, you look at what the left-wing so-called progressives believe in America and believe about Israel. The name Palestine, let's just go back and do some history. That's a European colonialist moniker placed by Greco-Roman invaders on the Holy Land of the Jews, specifically in order to disenfranchise the Jews from Judea, the people of Israel from the land of Israel. And when has it meant anything different? Oh, never. And for the last 2,000 years of world history, a Palestinian was a Jew. There's a Palestinian Talmud, a Palestinian Gaonet, the 4 holy cities of Palestine. Miss Palestine in the 1930s spoke Yiddish. The Palestine Post is today's Jerusalem Post. The soccer team of the Palestinians spoke Hebrew. All of a sudden in 1964, history gets reinvented, where Palestinians are Arabs. That's in language, by the way, in Arabic, it cannot even be pronounced. That's why they call it Palestine, because there's just no such thing. This entire mythological narrative about Jews being invaders after 3,000 years of continuous Jewish settlement in the Holy Land, which the Jews never left except at the tip of a spear. So these people are actually, not only are they backing ethnic cleansing, they want it to be repeated. They want the Jews to be removed again from their Holy Land, and claiming, of course, that it's the Jews who are the bigots. You know, we've heard that narrative before. This is all straight out anti-Semitism. They are duplicating Hitler's rhetoric. Ilhan Omar doesn't know this, but she paraphrased Mein Kampf. You know, she just did it on Twitter in English. But it's the same language. It's the same discussion. So that's what the hatred looks like. And instead of dealing with it in a consequential fashion, you have people talking about Islamophobia. Guess what? Nobody has it out for Muslims who doesn't have it out for Hindus and Buddhists and Sikhs, right? There's just no parallel to anti-Semitism. What they are against are the people who are criticizing radical Islamic terrorism. And fear of terrorism, fear of dismemberment is not a phobia.
Rabbi, who do you think is financing this type of indoctrination amongst the left? Have you or and your group identified who the culprits are of this perverse, not ideology, but indoctrination? Is there some sort of group that you've identified that is financing these movements or these professors or rallies? Has your group identified at that, or what do you think about that?
I don't think that our organization, you know, being as we promote Jewish values and that's our bailiwick, that we're going to specifically have knowledge that other people do not. But I think what you're asking is a question that actually has answers that the media is not publishing loud enough. It is obvious that money is flowing in from China, which is anti-democratic and totalitarian, and, by the way, very anxious to distract students' attention from the persecution of Uyghur Muslims in East Turkestan, right? I mean, that is a real occupation with real harm and real indoctrination camps and detention camps going on, persecuting Muslims who the so-called Muslim advocates in the United States don't seem to care about at all. Why do you think that's true? Because the Chinese are only paying for one kind of so-called Muslim protection. And then you look at the Islamic countries that are themselves funding terrorism. Are the Iranians trying to fund colleges in America? Of course they are. Qatari money by the millions is flowing into American universities. So many of these Middle Eastern studies departments have turned into woke anti-Semitic indoctrination centers, and that's largely on foreign cash. You've got, the Congress is now trying to pass legislation that will require universities to disclose much smaller contributions, by which I mean contributions greater than $50,000. Because right now, you can give millions of dollars and the IRS doesn't know where it comes from. We don't know which foreign government is given that money. Wouldn't it be great for us to see exactly which totalitarian, anti-Semitic, Middle Eastern governments are funding America's colleges and universities? And wouldn't that tell us something about why they've turned from institutions of American higher education to institutes of leftist woke indoctrination?
When we look at even foreign influence in trying to influence actually our universities, our younger people in this indoctrination against the Jewish community, what do you think should be done at federal and local level to prevent this to happen and to actually finally make a change into what is happening and the trend we have seen unfolding these years?
Well, the universities have to stop endorsing terrorism and have to stop teaching anti-Semitic narratives. Unfortunately, to really solve the problem, certain professors with tenure are going to need to lose their jobs. And until that happens, the indoctrination will not cease because that's what these guys do. Any university offering a course on Palestine, for example, Israel has never fought a war with Palestine. There have been multiple wars, all of which were started by the surrounding Arab nations, in which the so-called Palestinian Arabs happily joined in order to eradicate the Jews and expel the Jews from Israel. When you take it out of that context, you make it the big, powerful Israelis against the so-called persecuted Arab Palestinians, who, by the way, are indigenous, of course, to a place called Arabia. And these guys are the experts in occupation. We know that Arabs did not build the pyramids. They did not build the ziggurats. They were not the Persian government, but all of that is now controlled by Islam and largely, except for Iran, controlled by Arabs because of the banner of jihad. The entire northern coast of Africa is controlled by jihadi Arabists. So this idea that it's the Israelis who are the occupiers is universities teaching anti-Semitic indoctrination instead of actual education. And let me give you an example of how bad this is, because I went to Princeton when it was an actual higher education. There was something to be proud of for going to Princeton. Not so today, not so much today, right? Well, I remember that students were protesting against real genocides going on around the world. Darfur, student protests. Bosnia, student protests. Rwanda, student protests, calling attention to real problems and getting them solved. Today, that's not happening. Why? Because they're all indoctrinated to believe the world's problems can be summed up in one word, namely Palestine. Israel is the problem. It has to be Palestine. We can't have a Jewish state. Let's eradicate that, get rid of it, and then things will be marvelous. Just like countries like Iraq and Syria, which got rid of their Jews, and things have gone marvelously for them ever since, right? That's what they're learning at universities. If you believe that Syria and Iraq are your models of successful countries, yeah, so let's throw out the Jews.
Rabbi, I want to talk about the United States and interfaith dialogue because these are issues that I would believe that American Jews and American Muslims can cooperate on to try to calm and pacify the issues abroad, considering the great power of the United States and the massive influence that both communities have. Have you seen an outreach from Muslim American leaders to your group, to your coalition, asking to meet with you and to discuss how to find some sort of middle ground to solve these massive crises abroad and even domestically among both communities? Or have they stayed a bit far from you?
You know, we were formed in 2017, beginning of Trump 1, precisely because the Jewish left was saying so many things about the administration that were patently false and don't represent Jewish values and were false accusations against the president and his people. That, that's why we felt, that's what kind of caused rabbis to realize, hey, we better speak up because there needs to be a Jewish voice speaking for sanity. As soon as we got underway, I was looking for a Muslim partner. Let's
Mm.
find a Muslim organization that's willing to talk the same language. And, because obviously the same way the Abrahamic faiths can, if they can do the Abraham Accords with the UAE and Oman, we ought to be able to do that right here in America. Sadly, that is proven not to be the case. A lot of the people who we thought, might prove to be reasonable partners, October 7th came along and they were immediately cheerleading for Hamas. There are Muslim organizations, Hazara Muslims who are persecuted by other Muslims in Afghanistan. They are big allies of the Jews. Uyghur Muslims, again, as mentioned, because they're being persecuted by the Chinese, allies of the Jews who look at the Jews as a model of resilience in the face of the kind of oppression that they are facing right now. And there are Muslim organizations and Muslim partners who are, very proud to have them as friends. But you can't sidestep the fact that the largest Muslim advocacy organizations in America, groups like CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, ISNA, the Islamic Society of North America, these are anti-Semitic hate groups that, of course, if you criticize them, claim again that any sort of criticism is Islamophobia. But meanwhile, they are endorsing Hamas and only criticizing Israel as if somehow Israel, which is trying to rescue hostages, was causing harm in Gaza deliberately to Gazan civilians. They actually call it a genocide, what Israel's doing. They claim that Israel's committing a genocide. That is obviously anti-Semitic projection. Hamas is explicitly genocidal in its intent. But it also overlooks the fact that the accusations against Israel of genocide in Gaza date back 20 years. All of a sudden, after October 7th, they suddenly realized that over half the population of Gaza is under age 18, which is to say explosive geometric population growth, which is obviously the very opposite of genocide. So they've been lying to the American public, and Americans have been lying to themselves for the last 20 years straight. And once given that absolute truth, they just kept on going.
You mentioned all this misconception about the Orthodox Jewish community. Would you like to address the biggest misinterpretation of the role of the Jewish community in the United States?
What do you mean by the biggest misconception?
That's well, we refer to the fact that they believe, for example, that asking your hostage back is a sort of translates into genocide. This is obviously an amplification of an issue that it's much more complex than this. So yes, seem like I believe one of the biggest misconceptions is that the Jews wants to take over, as you say, occupy Palestine. So would you like to address that in the light of all your knowledge and the history that has been rewritten in a woke accent already, right? So what would you, if diplomacy could play a role between these two groups, what would be your message to addressing this?
First of all, there has to be a recognition that anti-Semitic bias is a real thing. And this view that the Jews somehow constitute a threat is a ridiculous problem. I mean, look at Israel right now. Israel has more Arabs in the Knesset than there are Jews in Egypt. There are more Arabs in the Knesset than there are Jews in Jordan. There are more Arabs in the Knesset than there are Jews in Iraq. When you're accusing Israel of being the apartheid state, it's probably because the speaker is the bigot. It's not the Israelis who have a problem. It's the people accusing them of apartheid and genocide and whatever else. And yet nobody is stepping forward to call them the racists that they actually are. So once you acknowledge that truth, then you can move forward. I mean, look at what, the UAE and Oman, they worked out, and Bahrain, they worked out deals with Israel precisely because the Israelis are anxious to make peace with anybody who's willing to talk peace. They were very happy to give the so-called Palestinian Arabs a state of their own, self-governance, simply because they obviously don't want the Knesset taken over by people who want to destroy the country. That's the problem with majority rule. Majorities can provide tyranny over their minority. That's the very thing that didn't happen in Israel and did happen in all the surrounding countries. So if you want to preserve Israel as a refuge for persecuted Jews, you're going to have to make sure that it's not taken over by people who want to destroy it. Okay, so we'll give them self-governance. They tried that in Gaza, and look where that ended up. Honestly, a benevolent Israeli control was much better for the Gazans than Hamas control. And any honest person would recognize that. So there's a lot that can be done if there's just stop demonizing people based on their ethnicity. Look at people based on their actual track record. Israel's track record is not one of genocide. Israel's track record is such that a resident of Gaza's population went up in the last year. That's number one. There's no genocide. Number two, the life expectancy of a Gazan is longer than that of an Egyptian. Ditto the Judea and Samaria, what Jordan dismissively called the West Bank. Arabs who live there have longer life expectancy than Jordanians. In other words, the Israelis are doing a better job of shepherding public health for the Arab population, much less business and education and whatever else, than the Arab governments, the totalitarian governments that surround Israel. Let Israel be the beacon of freedom that it is, and a lot of great things can happen, both for Jews and for Arabs in the region.
Thank you. That's very important to, finally put it clear.
And Rabbi, one last question for me to hopefully leave it on a positive note so we don't have to focus simply on the Middle East conflict. You mentioned that there was a Greek Orthodox priest, Catholics, and Protestants on this advisory board. How do you see the Jewish-Christian alliance, if you will, growing or burgeoning in the United States in the face of all of these issues that we've discussed today? Do you see it solidifying? Do you see it separating? Where do you see that alliance?
I think that the traditional branches of both are seeing an actual unification going on. You used the term interfaith before, and that's, it's an interesting term which is kind of loaded with the idea of like a religious dialogue, as if we're going to wallpaper over the theological chasms that exist between religious groups, including between Judaism and Christianity. What really happens is a religious liberty, faith-based partnership where, look, it doesn't matter how you got there. We both have this idea that there are two genders, not 20. We both have the idea that human life is sacred and by the way, that's not a coincidence. We obviously got it from the same place. So why shouldn't Jews and Christians work together on shared policy goals? Any number of times, actually, we as an organization have defended Christian groups. For example, those providing foster care, and their belief is it's part of their mission, and they only work together with other Christian families and Christian providers, and it's actually often left-wing Jews who question whether that's legitimate and whether that's protected. And we're the ones saying, absolutely it is. Because if that were threatened, it would threaten the religious liberty of Jews to place Jewish children in Jewish homes. So we favor the idea that each religious group ought to have liberty to operate the way that they believe. That is a completely shared policy goal. even though some would say that's actually detrimental to Jewish interests. No, it's not. It's protecting our interests over the long term. And that's something where our Christian partners absolutely see things the same way. And we could be working together to provide the same policy changes, which is honestly for the betterment of all Americans. The founding fathers used the book of Deuteronomy more than any other book in finding the values that made America great. Might as well exploit that.
Very well said,
Absolutely.
Rabbi.
Well
Thank you for
said.
that.
Thank you. And congratulations again on the appointment on this important position. And we hope that this commission will finally help bring some clarity. But besides that, where people can follow you, can find you, and can hear from your insightful commentary.
Well, thank you so much for that. I am on social media personally as Y Menken and YAAKOVMenken.com, but the organization Coalition for Jewish Values is, well, cjvalues.org is less typing than the full name, and CJ Values on your favorite social media. We look forward to greeting your viewers.
Thank you very much. And thanks again for joining Global View.
Thank you.
Thank you.